Jolie Bob Beauchamp, we need to talk to you right now.
About what? Who sent you in here?
What you're about to see would eventually be described as one of the most brazen cases of wildlife trafficking in Central Florida history. The man on your screen is Tariq Jolibois Beauchamp, a permitted conservationist celebrated by the state of Florida, and this footage shows the moment that reputation was destroyed forever.
The animals you filed as released with FWC that you sold to collectors. We have the ledger.
You don't just walk into my home office. I want a supervisor. I want to step from the desk. You need to back up.
For 4 years, 2 parallel ledgers sat in the same home office in Polk County, Florida, written in the same handwriting, kept by the same man. One was filed every single month with the state of Florida. The other was hidden in a locked drawer above it. 87 animals appeared in both. The numbers never matched. By the time federal agents from 3 different agencies finished cataloging what they found inside Heart of Florida Wildlife Rehab, the man who had been celebrated as the face of Central Florida conservation would be facing federal charges under the Endangered Species Act, the Lacey Act, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and a tax evasion count built on roughly $284,000 he never reported. And every single dollar of it had been earned by selling the very animals he was federally permitted to save. Quick question before we go any further. How much trust do you put in a self-reporting system? The kind where the person doing the work also files the paperwork on the work. Drop your honest answer in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now. This channel exposes the people who exploited trust the rest of us assumed was sacred, every single week. Tariq Anwar Jolibois Beauchamp was born in Lake Worth, Florida in 1980 to a Haitian-American father who worked as a postal carrier in Palm Beach County and a Louisiana Creole mother who taught 4th grade at a public elementary school in Green Acres. He was the middle of 3 children. The family was Catholic, hardworking, middle class, and devoted to the outdoors in the way that only people who grow up next to a Florida swamp can be. His earliest memory, he would later tell a Lakeland Ledger reporter in a 2019 profile, was of his grandfather lifting a baby gopher tortoise off a hot stretch of asphalt on State Road 7 and carrying it gently across the road to the scrub on the other side. He was 4 years old. He said it was the moment he decided what he wanted to do with his life. By elementary school, he was bringing home injured anoles, fledgling mockingbirds knocked out of palms by hurricane winds, and once, famously to his family, an entire baby raccoon whose mother had been hit by a car on Lake Worth Road. His mother kept the raccoon in a Rubbermaid bin in the garage for 3 weeks until a wildlife center in Loxahatchee finally took it. Teachers wrote on his report cards that he was, quote, animal obsessed in a way that was both endearing and occasionally disruptive to instruction. He was bright. He was articulate. He read at 2 grade levels ahead. His 6th grade science fair project on the predator-prey dynamics of the Everglades wood stork won first place at the county level. He attended Santa Lucia's Community High School in Lantana, where he joined the Future Farmers of America chapter as a freshman and stayed in it for all 4 years. He was elected chapter vice president his senior year. The yearbook lists him under 3 activities: FFA, varsity cross country, and the Audubon Club, which had 3 members. His senior quote, taken from John Muir, read, "In every walk with nature, one receives far more than he seeks." He enrolled at the University of Florida in 1998 as a wildlife ecology and conservation major. He paid his way through with a combination of Pell Grants, a partial FFA scholarship, and a part-time job at a Gainesville exotic pet store called Reptile Junction, where he worked from his sophomore year through graduation. The store sold ball pythons, leopard geckos, blue-tongued skinks, and a rotating cast of unusual reptiles whose paperwork, in the words of a co-worker who would later be interviewed by federal investigators, was, quote, never something you wanted to look at too hard. He earned $8.25 an hour. He learned in those 4 years the entire informal economy of the exotic pet trade, who the buyers were, what they paid, what species moved fastest, and which papers no one ever checked. He graduated in 2003 with a 3.4 GPA. He spent the next 8 years bouncing between contract positions, A season with the Florida Park Service at Myakka River, 2 years as a junior keeper at a small private zoo near Sarasota, 4 years as a field technician on a University of South Florida gopher tortoise survey project, and finally, in 2011, a permanent position as the assistant curator of reptiles at a roadside attraction near Kissimmee. He met his wife, Camille, a labor and delivery nurse, at a friend's wedding in Bradenton in 2009. They married in 2011. Their first child, a daughter, was born in 2013. A son followed in 2015. A second daughter in 2018. In 2016, he applied for and received a Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission Class III rehabilitation permit, the credential that would change the trajectory of his life. He and Camille used a small inheritance from her father, combined with a home equity loan against their first house in Auburndale, to buy a 12-acre property near Lake Wales. They cleared part of it, built 3 flight enclosures, dug a recovery pond, fenced 2 tortoise yards, and opened Heart of Florida Wildlife Rehab. He filed his first FWC monthly disposition report in October of that year. It listed 2 animals, a barred owl with a fractured wing, released, and a hatchling alligator turned over to a partner facility. The report was honest. So were the next 60 months of reports. So, very nearly, were the ones that followed. To understand how Tariq Jolibois Beauchamp was able to do what he did, you have to understand the regulatory architecture that he operated inside. In the United States, the rehabilitation of native wildlife is governed by a patchwork of overlapping authorities. At the federal level, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service administers the Endangered Species Act, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and the Lacey Act. At the state level in Florida, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission issues the actual rehabilitation permits, Class I, Class II, and Class III, in ascending order of authority, and conducts the routine oversight of permit holders. There are roughly 450 active rehabilitation permit holders in the state of Florida at any given time. The FWC employs a small number of investigators to oversee them all. The permit holder is required to do 3 things. He must intake animals lawfully, providing a description, a circumstance of intake, and a date. He must care for them according to species-specific standards published by FWC. And critically, he must file a monthly disposition report listing what happened to every animal in his care. The dispositions are limited to a fixed menu, released to the wild, transferred to another facility, euthanized for humane reasons, died during rehabilitation, held for ongoing care. Each entry is supposed to be backed up by records, release coordinates, transfer paperwork, euthanasia logs, necropsy notes. In practice, those backup records are reviewed only during audits, which happen, on average, once every 3 to 5 years per facility. The system rests almost entirely on the assumption that the person filling out the form is telling the truth. There are, by design, very few cross-checks. The animals that come in are wild animals. They have no chips, no tags, no registration. The animals that leave, if released, vanish back into Florida scrub. The animals that die are, in most cases, cremated or buried on site. There is no inventory in the classical sense. There is only the rehabilitator's word, recorded in his own handwriting, and filed once a month with an under-resourced agency. The trust in that word is what the entire system is built on. And the trust in that word was what Tariq Jolibois Beauchamp learned, beginning sometime in late 2020, that he could sell. The first transaction federal investigators were able to date with precision occurred on the 7th of September, 2021. An eastern indigo snake, Dry Marchand couperi, federally listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, the longest native snake in North America, had been brought into Heart of Florida Wildlife Rehab 2 weeks earlier by a Polk County resident who had found it slow-moving in his irrigation ditch. Tariq examined it, noted minor dehydration, and listed it on his intake log. Standard protocol called for a short rehydration period, an assessment of release suitability, and either release at the original capture site or transfer to a long-term holding partner for ESA-compliant disposition. What happened instead was this. On the 6th of September, Tariq received an encrypted Instagram direct message from a private collector in Ohio who had been following Heart of Florida Wildlife Rehab for months and whom Tariq had been quietly cultivating in a parallel direct message thread for over a year. The collector asked, in a coded phrase the two of them had developed, quote, any healthy long ones available, whether an eastern indigo was on hand. Tariq replied, quote, one came in last week. The collector offered $5,500. Tariq countered at $6,200. They settled at $5,800, paid in Bitcoin, with the snake to be picked up at an exotic pet expo in Daytona Beach the following weekend. On the 8th of September, one day after the sale was agreed, Tariq filed an addendum to his August monthly disposition report. The addendum stated that the eastern indigo snake had been released to the wild on the 8th of September at a GPS coordinate within Highlands Hammock State Park, and that a small subdermal tracking transponder had been activated and registered. The transponder, of course, had not been activated. The snake had not been released. The snake was, at that moment, in a temperature-controlled plastic bin in the back of his garage, waiting for the drive to Daytona. The FWC received the report. The report went into the file. The file was never audited. The pattern that began with that snake would repeat itself, with minor variations, 77 more times over the next 39 months. The customer base grew quickly. Word moved through the underground exotic collector network on encrypted apps, and Tariq, by mid-2022, had a regular roster of 23 buyers across 11 states and 3 countries. The species sold expanded beyond indigos to gopher tortoises, American kestrels, red-shouldered hawks, eastern diamondback rattlesnakes, alligator-snapping turtles, southern hognose snakes, and a small number of specimens he had personally collected from the wild on weekend trips into the green swamp. The method of selection became, over time, almost clinical. Tariq would receive an inquiry. He would check his current intake. If a matching specimen was present and could be plausibly described as either released or dead in the corresponding FWC paperwork, he would proceed. If not, he would either wait for the right intake to arrive or, in roughly 20% of cases, collect the requested specimen himself from the wild and integrate it into the facility's books just long enough to launder it through the rehabilitation paperwork on its way out the back door. Animals never crossed each other in his records. Each one had a clean intake date, a clean disposition date, and a coordinate or cause of death that, on paper, would survive a quick glance. He filed every monthly report on time. He never missed one. The revenue accumulated. By the end of 2022, he had cleared roughly $91,000. By the end of 2023, $210,000. By December of 2024, the running total stood at approximately $284,000. The money moved through Cash App, through Zelle, through a Coinbase wallet, and through cash drops at expos. None of it appeared on the joint tax return he and Camille filed each April. None of it appeared on the financial disclosures attached to his permit renewals. It went instead into private school tuition at 2 Lakeland academies for his older children, into a new 2023 Toyota Tundra purchased outright with a cashier's check, into roughly $42,000 of new flight cage and quarantine infrastructure at Heart of Florida Wildlife Rehab itself, the rehabilitation operation, in a paradox that federal prosecutors would later quote at length in their sentencing memo, being expanded with the proceeds of the illegal trade it was simultaneously laundering. If this is hitting you the way it's hitting me, take 10 seconds and subscribe before we continue. This channel covers cases the mainstream wildlife press will not touch, the trusted intermediaries, the permitted insiders, the people who turned conservation credentials into a private revenue stream. Hit subscribe, hit the bell, and let me know in the comments what punishment you think fits a man who sold the same animals he was paid by the state to protect. The end of Tariq. Jolibois-Beauchamp's operation did not begin in Polk County. It began, instead, in a windowless office at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Office of Law Enforcement's Atlanta Field Office in the spring of 2023, when a senior special agent named Lorraine Quintero opened a case file titled Operation Spotted Tortoise. The file's stated objective was the disruption of the Florida to Collector pipeline of trafficked native reptiles, a pipeline that had, by then, produced 4 prosecutions of mid-level brokers in Georgia and South Carolina, but had never reached the source-level suppliers in Florida itself. Quintero's team began with the buyer end of the pipeline. They served administrative subpoenas on 3 private collectors who had been identified in the earlier Georgia cases. 2 of the 3 eventually agreed to cooperate, both named, in interviews conducted in May and July of 2023, the same supplier. Both used the same phrase to describe him. Quote, "He's the one with the rehab. He has paper on everything. He's the one you trust." Quintero opened a sub-file on Heart of Florida Wildlife Rehab in August 2023. For the next 13 months, a small team of USFWS agents and Florida FWC investigators built the case quietly. They obtained by subpoena 3 years of Cash App and Zelle records associated with bank accounts in Tariq's and Camille's names. They obtained, by federal warrant, his Instagram direct message history. They cross-referenced every species mentioned in the message threads against the corresponding month's FWC disposition reports. They watched the patterns repeat themselves. They built a spreadsheet of 78 suspected transactions. They drafted, in early September 2024, a final operational plan that called for an undercover purchase, the kind of purchase that would put the case beyond any reasonable doubt about identity, intent, or knowledge. On the 11th of October, 2024, a USFWS special agent operating under a false collector identity that had been seeded across 2 reptile trade forums for 8 months sent Tariq an encrypted Instagram message. He used the established coded phrase. He asked whether 2 healthy long ones were available. Tariq replied, 8 minutes later, "I have a pair." He named a price of $14,000 for both, payable in Bitcoin, with pickup to be arranged at a Cracker Barrel parking lot off Interstate 4, north of Tampa, the following Saturday. The drop happened at 11:47 a.m. on October 19th. Tariq drove his Tundra. The undercover agent drove a rented Chevy Equinox. The exchange took 4 minutes. 2 locking acrylic transport containers, each holding 1 adult eastern indigo snake, moved from Tariq's truck bed to the back of the Equinox. The Bitcoin had cleared into a wallet under federal control 12 hours earlier. 6 surveillance vehicles, positioned at varying distances around the parking lot, recorded the entire exchange from 4 angles. Tariq drove home and, that evening, filed an addendum to his October disposition report stating that 2 eastern indigo snakes had been released to the wild that afternoon, with tracking transponders activated. The addendum was, the special agents would later note in their case summary, identical in structure to the one he had filed for the first snake 3 years and 41 days earlier. The search warrants were executed at 6:14 a.m. on the morning of December 14th, 2024. 3 teams, 21 agents, 1 target property, 12 acres, near Lake Wales. The teams included USFWS Office of Law Enforcement, Florida FWC investigators, FBI Tampa Field Office personnel, an IRS criminal investigation forensic accountant, and a veterinary technician under contract with USFWS to assess the welfare of any live animals recovered from the site. In the climate-controlled outbuilding at the rear of the property, agents recovered 47 protected and endangered specimens that did not appear in any current intake documentation on file. The animals were cataloged, photographed, and transferred, over the course of 2 days, to long-term sanctuary facilities partnered with USFWS. Among them were 6 eastern indigo snakes, 9 gopher tortoises, 3 American kestrels, 2 red-shouldered hawks, 4 eastern diamondback rattlesnakes, and a juvenile alligator snapping turtle that, at the time of recovery, was being kept in a kiddie pool in the corner of the building. In the locked file cabinet in the home office on the second floor of the main house, agents recovered 3 years of paper financial records, a thumb drive containing encrypted messenger backups, a notebook of Bitcoin wallet seed phrases, a folder of cashier's check stubs, and, most significantly, 2 bound green ledgers kept in the top drawer above the cabinet, each labeled by year in black Sharpie on the spine. One was the field copy duplicate of his FWC monthly disposition reports. The other, labeled in the same handwriting, was titled, quote, True Disp. The 2 ledgers ran in parallel for 48 months. They were kept by the same hand. They were updated on the same days. They contained the same animals, listed in the same order. The disposition columns, however, did not match. 87 specimens across 4 years had entries in the True Dispy ledger that read variations of sold, OK collector, 5,500 cash, picked up at facility. The corresponding entries in the FWC field copy ledger read variations of released, GPS tag activated 11/18/2022, last detected 11/22/2022, presumed established. For 87 animals, 2 parallel records existed in the same office, kept by the same hand. And the dishonest one was the one he had filed every month for 48 months with the state of Florida. The forensic accountant traced the 78 transactions over the next 10 weeks. The buyer-side cooperation that had opened the case in the first place provided corroboration for 41 of them. Encrypted message threads, recovered in clear from a backup file, Tariq had foolishly synced to his iCloud, corroborated all 78. The Bitcoin wallet seed phrases, decrypted by an FBI cryptocurrency specialist, opened access to a Coinbase account holding approximately $191,000 in unreported income. None of it appeared on the Jolibois-Beauchamp household tax returns. The IRS criminal referral was filed in January 2025. The arrest, when it came, was not dramatic. Tariq had been notified, through his retained counsel, that an indictment was imminent. On the morning of April 14, 2025, he drove himself to the federal courthouse in downtown Tampa, accompanied by his attorney, and surrendered. He was processed, fingerprinted, photographed, and released on a $100,000 unsecured bond with travel restricted to the Middle District of Florida and a prohibition on any contact with permitted wildlife facilities. The confrontation that mattered, the one that broke him, had happened 4 months earlier, on the morning of the search warrant in the kitchen of his own home, with his wife standing in the doorway holding their youngest daughter, while a USFWS special agent named Lorraine Quintero walked him through, page by page, the contents of the True Dispy ledger that had been removed from his office 20 minutes earlier and was now sitting open on his kitchen table. Mr. Jolibois-Beauchamp, do you recognize this notebook? I would like to speak with an attorney. That is your right. Before you exercise it, I want to be clear that we are not asking you questions. I am showing you a document and noting what it is for the record. I understand. This entry, dated November 18th, 2022. Eastern Indigo, sold. Oklahoma collector, $5,500 cash, picked up at facility. Do you wish to make any statement? I want an attorney present. Acknowledged. We are done speaking with you. Agents will continue the search. You may remain in the residence, or you may step outside with your wife and child. We are not arresting you today. The agent later wrote in her report that Tariq did not look at the ledger when she opened it. He looked instead at his wife. His wife, the report noted, was the one looking at the ledger. She was reading it, line by line, while their daughter slept on her shoulder. When Quintero finally closed the ledger and slid it into an evidence bag, Camille did not say anything. She turned, carried the child upstairs, and did not come back down for the remaining 4 hours that the agents were on the property. The indictment, filed in the Middle District of Florida on April 14, 2025, ran to 41 pages and listed 11 counts. Counts 1 through 4 charged violations of the Endangered Species Act, 16 United States Code, Section 1538, for the unlawful take and sale of 14 eastern indigo snakes. Counts 5 through 9 charged violations of the Lacey Act, 16 United States Code, Section 3372, for the interstate transport of wildlife taken in violation of state law, and for the separate offense of false labeling of wildlife in commerce. The Lacey Act counts being, in the words of the Assistant United States Attorney handling the case, the central federal hammer in the prosecution. Count 10 charged Migratory Bird Treaty Act violations for the sale of 14 federally protected raptors. Count 11 charged conspiracy. 2 additional counts charged wire fraud for the use of interstate electronic communications in furtherance of the scheme. And a final count charged tax evasion under Title 26 for the unreported income. His defense attorney, a Tampa-based federal defender named Marisol Etheridge, filed a not guilty plea at the arraignment and immediately opened plea negotiations. By summer of 2025, the contours of a deal were visible. Tariq would plead guilty to 4 counts, 2 Lacey Act counts, 1 Endangered Species Act count, and the tax evasion count, in exchange for the dismissal of the remaining charges. His advisory federal guidelines range, calculated by probation, was 41 to 63 months in federal prison. Cooperation against the 23 named buyers, 4 of whom had not yet been charged, was expected to reduce his exposure by an additional 6 to 10 months under the substantial assistance provisions of Section 5K1.1 of the sentencing guidelines. The restitution and forfeiture exposure was, in some ways, the harsher half of the punishment. The government sought forfeiture of the entire Heart of Florida wildlife rehab property, the 12 acres, the 3 flight enclosures, the recovery pond, the climate-controlled outbuilding, on the theory that the facility had functioned as an instrumentality of the offense. The government sought forfeiture of the 2023 Toyota Tundra. The government sought restitution in the amount of $284,000 to be paid to a federal wildlife conservation fund. The IRS, separately, asserted a tax liability with penalties of approximately $91,000. The Florida FWC, on the 19th of December, 2024, 5 days after the search warrant, commenced administrative permit revocation proceedings. The proceedings were brief. Tariq did not contest them. His Class 3 rehabilitation permit was revoked, with prejudice, on the 17th of January, 2025. The USDA APHIS captive wildlife exhibitor license was suspended the same week. Heart of Florida Wildlife Rehab, as a permitted entity, ceased to exist. The Instagram account, the TikTok, and the YouTube channel were taken down by Camille on the night of the search warrant. The roughly 187,000 followers who had watched 4 years of tortoise releases and owl rehabilitations and school group educational visits woke up on the 15th of December, 2024, to find that the account they had followed was simply gone. There was no farewell post. There was no explanation. The local Lakeland Ledger ran a story on the 18th of December. The story ran above the fold, with a photograph of Tariq from the 2019 FWC commendation ceremony, smiling next to a state commissioner holding a barred owl on a gloved hand. At the sentencing memo stage of the proceedings, the United States Attorney's Office included a paragraph that has since been quoted in 2 US FWS enforcement briefings and 1 Florida FWC policy review. The paragraph read, "The defendant's conduct represents a category of trafficking offense for which the regulatory system has, to date, had no adequate defense. The defendant was not a poacher operating in opposition to the permit system. He was the permit system. The agency relied on his accuracy. His accuracy was the architecture. He sold the architecture for, on average, $3,640 per specimen, across 87 specimens, over a period of 4 years. The agency had no mechanism, during that period, to detect the deception." The FWC, in March of 2025, announced a comprehensive review of rehabilitation permit renewal protocols. The review, which is ongoing as of the time of this video, has proposed 3 significant changes. The first is the introduction of unannounced facility audits, with the audit frequency increased from once every 3 to 5 years to a minimum of once per 12 months for any permit holder handling federally listed species. The second is the introduction of biometric tagging, microchip implantation on intake, for all rehabilitation specimens of any species listed under the ESA or the MBTA, with the tag scan required on disposition and the scan record uploaded to a centralized FWC database. The third, which has drawn opposition from a coalition of legitimate rehabilitators citing administrative burden, is the requirement of a second signature verification on monthly disposition reports, meaning the report could no longer be filed by the permit holder alone. The case has been cited, in the period since the indictment, in at least 4 federal enforcement briefings as the leading example of what USFWS has begun to call trusted intermediary trafficking, a category of wildlife crime in which the trafficker is not a poacher or a smuggler in the classical sense, but is, instead, a credentialed person operating inside the conservation system, using the credential itself as the cover for the offense. As of the recording of this video, Tariq Jolibois Beauchamp has not yet been sentenced. The plea agreement, by all reporting, is expected to be entered in the fall of 2025, with sentencing to follow approximately 90 days later. He is, almost certainly, going to federal prison. The advisory range puts him between 3.5 and 5.25 years before any cooperation reduction. His preferred designation, according to filings made by his attorney, is FCI Coleman Low, a low-security federal facility in Sumter County, Florida, approximately 70 miles north of his home, which would allow his wife and 3 children regular visitation over the course of his sentence. The Heart of Florida Wildlife Rehab property has been listed for forfeiture in the criminal proceeding. The flight cages stand empty. The recovery pond is overgrown. The 47 specimens recovered on the morning of the search warrant have been distributed among 4 partner sanctuary facilities across the southeastern United States, where most of them will live out the remainder of their natural lives in captivity, because none of them, having been kept off the legitimate intake books for unknown periods of time, in unknown conditions, with unknown provenance, can be returned safely to the wild. They are, in the precise language of the USFWS disposition memo that accompanied each transfer, animals of unrecoverable provenance. They are, in plainer language, animals whose paperwork the man who was supposed to write that paperwork chose not to write. This case was breathtaking in its quiet cruelty. But the next one waiting for you on the right-hand side is the kind of betrayal that takes a few minutes to even comprehend. Click it now.